Chapter 2, How Hotaru Suzuki Won the Lottery. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Attributed to Seneca. Hotaru Suzuki was about to win the lottery, but not the actual lottery. Sure, there would be money, but he entered no contest, and he wouldn't be able to collect any winnings for about a decade. Sometimes joy comes disguised as evil, and evil comes disguised as good. It takes a lifetime to figure out which is which, and for cowards, the difficulty is compounded. Hotaru Suzuki had trouble making eye contact and was prone to fright. This was one of many things that kept him from fully joining the ranks of Inigawa Kai, the least prominent Yakuza family, a notorious crime syndicate in Japan. He was more of an operational asset for the occasional gray area job owing to his skills in forgery, digital, and otherwise. He made mistakes, though, and so pulled away from the mob. Now he lived on Cat Island, Aoshimehime, and was one of 4 permanent residents. When he moved, he contributed youth and enough financial resources to keep the neighbors polite, and it was here that Hotaru intended to spend the rest of his days. The island was beautiful, relatively remote, quiet, and full of 100 or more cats, even after the poisoning event half a decade ago referred to by the old gossips who were his neighbors. They told him it was the fault of an elderly gentleman who died, first putting poison into fish he caught, then distributing those fish to the cats, then succumbing to his own careless handling of the poison. Whatever happened, he left the house in which Hotaru now lived. Personally, Hotaru suspected one of the gossipy old women, the younger of the two, who couldn't hide a certain look behind her cataracts. He wondered if the old man incidentally poisoned himself or had been poisoned, but he lacked the courage to investigate. Hotaru only saw the 4th resident of the island once or twice. This resident was a very elderly man who dwelt alone at the far end of Aoshima, and, according to the gossips, was a full-time resident before any of them. He fished, and that was it. Hotaru decided he didn't need to probe into the personal matters of these hermits and gossips too deeply, not immediately anyway. After all, he had his own past. Beyond himself and the older residents, there were tourists and those who catered to the loose dollars of those tourists. Merchandise tables would be set up in the town square of the island 6 days out of the week by merchants who came in on the ferries. The town square itself was large enough. It harkened to a time when many more people called the community home before the sardine fishery closed. Most who conducted business on Aoshima now came in the morning and left in the evening, except for one young lady in her 20s who owned a private boat and did a trendy sort of ghost tour that Hotaru wasn't very keen on, but for which he and the other 3 residents were compensated through a token of profits. It was a lunar thing, which meant it was only a monthly event, so the island's residents withstood it. The 100 cats of the island, growing in number every day, were accustomed to tourist and merchant traffic, which had flourished as the internet revealed the feline curiosity that was Cat Island. Hotaru, gentle, timid soul that he was, liked the idea of an island filled with cats. And he liked even more the idea of perfecting his manga and living from what he managed to squirrel away during his time working, well, perhaps not with, but adjacent the mob. He'd only been on the island about 3 months and found himself enjoying the process of becoming something of a hikikomori. All right, here's a footnote. Hikikomori, also known as severe social withdrawal, is total withdrawal from society and seeking extreme degrees of social isolation and confinement. Hikikomori refers to both the phenomenon in general and the recluses themselves, described as loners or modern-day hermits. That's available from Wikipedia as of August 14th, 2024. And found himself enjoying the process of becoming something of a hikikomori. Accordingly, when, at 11 in the morning on a summer Tuesday, there was a deafening, rage-filled knock at Hotaru's door, the terror he felt almost paralyzed him. Even worse, he had a right to it. About 8 cats who wandered into his house at some point scattered at the violent knock. Hotaru's eyes were wide, and though trembling, he managed to calm his breathing enough to approach the door. There would be no answer to the terrible question of who was behind it unless he opened it. The knocker was insistent, and by the loudness of those knocks, strong. If Hotaru didn't open up, he expected the door would burst open regardless. After another breath and a swallow, Hotaru turned the old knob, creaking the ancient door open. A Japanese man of average height, appearance, and professional grooming held up a piece of paper next to a badge, and this is what he said. "You are Hotaru Suzuki." "Yes, sir. I am Hotaru Suzuki." "Sergeant Kaido Yamada, Ihimi Prefecture. We have a warrant to search the premises. Please stand aside." Oh, please, come in. Hotaru clasped his hands in front of his waist and bowed as half a dozen police personnel, some officers, some bearing forensic credentials, swept into his little home. None removed their shoes, which Hotaru strove to ignore. His home was humble, at less than 1,000 square feet. It had 6 rooms, a bathroom, and a crawl space. They would find whatever they needed soon, and he would sweep the floor after them. Kaido Yamada wore a pale shirt, black pants, and a suit jacket with a golden pen that had English lettering on it. It seemed to say Las Vegas, but Hotaru wasn't especially skilled in English, so he wasn't sure. He just remembered the look of such lettering from commercials, film, and the like. Kaido's badge was on a lanyard about his neck, and his shoes looked expensive. Hotaru Suzuki was in slippers and pajama bottoms that featured multiple printed depictions of a popular anime waifu. Said waifu smiled in a skimpy outfit and gave her spunkiest thumbs up. Hotaru also had a featureless black t-shirt. Kaido looked at Hotaru's pajama pants and made a sour face. The wrinkles about his eyebrows indicated inspection was a regular activity of his. The frown lines about his mouth also attested as much. After making a tutting sound and wiping at his thin beard, he returned his gaze to the old house Hotaru lived in and started inspecting it keenly from the center of the room while other police made a mess of things. Not that there was a lot of mess to be made. Hotaru wasn't a slob, but he was a single man in the middle of life and only cleaned things where he had to. Of greatest concern to him was the treatment of his sketches in that section of the old house he had converted into an office for its view on the water. After about 5 minutes, Hotaru ventured, What is this about, Sergeant Yamada-san?" "I think you already know the answer to that." "Were I aware of the answer, perhaps I would not have asked the question." "Or perhaps you play pretend," the sergeant offered. Hotaru risked meeting Kaido's eye, but quickly turned his gaze back to the ground. He could feel his pulse pounding, and he had to grip his hand in front of his waist to quell shaking. Finally he said, Is this about the police here a week ago?" Kaido raised an eyebrow at him. "What do you know about that?" There were police here a week ago in the night. They interviewed everyone. They came in their own boat because the ferry was done. They asked me about a young woman, Harini, Himari Fujimoto," Kaido offered. "An autistic girl who is an unrestricted resident of Matsuzu Hospital. She just turned 18 a few months ago. She is, or was, still getting used to being unrestricted. At least that's what it seems like." "Yes, Himari is what they said." "Why did you lie to the police that night?" "I didn't lie to the police that night." "Are you a betting man, Mr. Suzuki?" "You're the man with the pen from Las Vegas." Hotaru kept his eyes on the ground. Kaido looked genuinely surprised. He removed the pen, looked at the lettering, turned back to Hotaru. "You can read English." "I know what a souvenir looks like. Everybody knows that those words in English are..." "But I've never been to Las Vegas."
Have you ever been out of the country, Hotaru?
No! What? You can't see that and see Las Vegas? You never watch a movie?
You're clever at liar, aren't you?
I'm not lying!
Then why do I have this warrant?
Kaido pulled it out of a pocket.
I don't know.
Hotaru's voice was getting a bit louder, and he was starting to hyperventilate. I opened the door before I even knew you had a warrant, didn't I? I didn't know you had a warrant!
Sit down,
said the sergeant, indicating one of the 2 chairs at the little table in the room Hotaru used for dining and other things. Hotaru obliged, and the sergeant sat across from him, leaning the top of his knee on the table and looking around the room for a moment as police personnel continued their search. At length, Kaido said,
This is a nice place for a guy who draws manga.
I have saved the money.
I know. From your time in the Yakuza.
I was never in Yakuza.
If I make you take off your shirt, will I see tattoos on your back?
No! Hotaru said emphatically, and then, surprising himself, he stood fast enough to knock the chair back from the table and whipped off his shirt to reveal a weak chest and skinny arms in front of a back with a spine like a stegosaurus, all pale enough he could have been mistaken for European.
See? Nothing! Not even sunlight! So, you were a temp.
Sergeant Yamada-san, what have I done?
Well, in my estimation,
Kaido Yamada brought his leg down and leaned forward.
You've abducted, molested, murdered, dismembered, and disposed of an artistic girl who was the daughter of the Yamaguchi Gumi.
Hotaru sat down heavily and missed the scooted chair, dazedly scrambling from the floor to resume sitting properly, stuttering,
Sergeant Yamada-san, I have done no such thing.
And he pulled the chair even closer so he could bow to the table, hands flat and rubbing together in a show of supplication.
That's not the testimony of other residents on the island.
They're old gossips, Sergeant Yamada-san, and I'm new here. Now he met the sergeant's eye.
Of course they'd be suspicious. Who told you anything? Mokoto. She has a glint in her eye. Did you see? She's an old gossip. She will tell you whatever you want to hear and believe it immediately. We are all 4 of us on the Cat Island. We are all outcasts for one reason or another. Maybe our own personal failings. I could not do this thing about which you ask. I am a coward, Sergeant Yamada-san.
And a little freak, too, Kaido replied, tapping on his phone for a moment, then turning it so Hotaru and showing him several hand-drawn pictures from a serial publication.
You drew this?
Sergeant Yamada-san, such manga pays. I have to eat.
I thought you saved your own money.
Well, I did, but it's not going to last forever.
How do you think this cheap hentai, because I know the difference, Hotaru, how do you think this smutty hentai will look in court?
What are you saying?
That some old gossipy ladies and spicy cartoons are enough to convict a man?
Sergeant Yamada-san! One of the police personnel bellowed. From how the voice was muffled, it seemed he was yelling from the crawl space. A moment later, he ran into the common room, wiping dirt off himself and holding a little baggie with a fragment of receipt. Sergeant Kaido Yamada stood, accepting the piece of evidence, and replied over his shoulder, closely examining the baggie as he did so.
No, Hotaru, but this appears to be a receipt from a convenience store on the mainland along the primary route to this island, right where you get on the ferry. It's quite a long way from Himari Fujimoto's hospital, but it is from Miss Himari Fujimoto's closely managed bank account. Can you explain how this little piece of your receipt is in your home? I've never seen that. How do you know it's from her bank account? You just found it. How do you know anything about you? Your man put that there. Really? Kaido slammed his fist on the table and one of the four old legs beneath buckled. Hotaru shook and put his head down. Kaido said, "Arrest him. He must be questioned properly at the station." "But I've never seen that. No, I refuse. I need to contact a legal defense. One of the officers backhanded Hotaru, and given his personality profile, that should have ended it. But the blow had the opposite effect somehow, snapping the fellow's brain into escape mode. He began to fight like a weasel in a meat grinder. There was a great commotion. It took 4 of the 6 who accompanied Sergeant Kairo Yamada to restrain the skinny hentai artist and mob forger. They dragged him out of his house while he kicked and shrieked. Kaito Yamada took several steps up a slight rise from the suspect's house to make a phone call. The woman on the other end picked up after about 6 rings and sounded drunk. Kaito said, "Fujimoto-san, we have the dirty Inigaiwa Kai, raccoon the dog. He was indeed hiding among the cats." There was a sniff on the other end of the line. Good. Justice for my poor Himari." This was followed by drunken tears. "You must have water, Fujimoto-san, and the rest. Perhaps avoid that extra cup of sake." "If you damn police did your job, this would have been resolved a week ago." Kaido held the phone away from his head and grimaced, then replied, "Yes, of course, yes. But now, of course, there is no reason to avenge against the Inagawa Kai." "Shut up! You did it!" A hiccup followed a breathy exhalation that an experienced listener would have identified as a heartburn burp. Then, "You stopped a gang of war, Inspector Gadget. Good for you." And she hung up. Sergeant Kaito Yamada sighed and stared at the phone for about 10 seconds. The suspect, Hotaru Suzuki, managed to kick an officer in a tender area, free his legs, and sprint from his new police escort, still shirtless in waifu pajamas. After a few shameful grunts, the kicked officer brought a taser to bear and zapped Hotaru, who fell on his face like a sack of squid. His hands were already cuffed behind him, and he couldn't resist the electric rictus from the taser. As Kaito Yamada made his way to the police boat moored where ferries normally were, he saw 2 old ladies wearing dresses that were out of fashion when they were new. One of the 2, who looked about 10 years younger than the other, said, "Good work, Inspector-san," and bowed. This was Makoto. "Thank you, but I am only a sergeant. We didn't need an inspector yet. Thank you for your cooperation." "Oh, I'm so sorry, Sergeant-san, but thank you. That man, I know he was a bad man. He always kept it to himself, so quiet. A man his age with cats on an island, quiet. I knew he was hiding something." "Thank you for your cooperation," Kaito Yamada replied and bowed, then turned to board the boat before she could say anything else. He did indeed notice a glint in her eye, the one called Makoto, and this was his first doubt. The men he was a superior to were generally good men, but all people have secrets. And Sergeant Kaito Yamada understood at least some of his crew had ties to the Yamaguchi-gumi of the Yakuza. But he also knew the inspector to whom he reported, his own superior officer, had similar affiliations. Despite this obvious conflict of interest, Kaito was confident in his own evaluation of the situation. The suspect fit a dozen profile points, like getting money for the hentai he produced. Hentai was pornographic manga. The suspect had mafia ties and lived alone on an island right in the vicinity of an abduction
and at an artery where many single women would show up for internet photos with all the cats. Furthermore, prior his move some months ago, Hotaru lived in a district where an unidentified serial killer was known to operate. There were no killings in that district for about 4 months, which would conform to the pattern around which Hotaru Suzuki moved to Cat Island. Last, the abduction was of an autistic woman with ties to the most powerful Yakuza clan in the country. And the suspect was affiliated to the third most powerful Yakuza family, the generic syndicate of the group. Then Kaido's officer found that receipt. Maybe its discovery was a little convenient, but then again, maybe not. There was a part of Sergeant Kaido Yamada that doubted the validity of the suspect's arrest. Cat Island's gossipy old woman Mokoto solidified his doubt with her attempted reassurances. She was indeed of that gossip-happy breed who spread old wives' tales like wildfire and deny any activity of the kind when such gossip produces hardship for those against whom it is leveled. The uneasiness that she imparted remained with Sergeant Kaido Yamada for his final years on the force, especially when murders began in Hotaru's old neighborhood again. Maybe they were from a different serial killer in the area, a copycat killer. Young Hotaru Suzuki was convicted and sentenced to the death penalty, landing him squarely among 100 others on death row. The jury looked at the hente he had drawn, considered what history was known of the man, and the proximity of Hotaru to the incident when the crime occurred. The prosecutor did a great job painting a sort of tale of dismemberment and savvy, supposing Hotaru fed the remains of the woman to island cats. It was a grisly, sensational narrative the media absolutely adored. And indeed, Hotaru's imprisonment did ultimately stop any reprisals from the Yamaguchi-gumi against the Inigawa-kai, and vice versa. The real reason behind the Turbo trial. The snag that undid everything came in the year 2027, almost exactly 4 years from the disappearance of Himari Fujimoto. It was the end of summer, and Himari Fujimoto, long thought dead, simply reappeared. She arrived at precisely 9 in the evening on a Thursday, walking straight into Matsuzawa Hospital as though she owned the place, and heading up the stairs via her normal route to the room she normally occupied. This caused a commotion that would result in Kaido Yamada resigning in disgrace. Here's how it happened. Himari went straight to her old room on the 5th floor, number 333, then immediately had a knockdown, drag-out, scream and cry and floor roll and meltdown fit. Since she was legally dead over 4 years, another patient had been given her room. Being autistic, Himari was used to a certain procedure and pattern of events. When there were interruptions to those patterns, it induced a sort of panic attack. Here was something she was not used to or able to comprehend, so she shut down. A keen observer would have noticed a slight change in Himari on her return. She was dirty, but not malnourished. She must have spent time outdoors somewhere, but it didn't look like she was there long, and she was wearing the exact same clothes as when she disappeared. This confirmed by investigatory efforts soon after the supposed abduction. She had half a bag of beef jerky with her, and here's the key difference between the Himari of the past and the Himari that showed up 4 years later. She was slightly more socially capable. That's not saying much, but she was able to calm down more quickly than was the case before. Even so, her progress didn't have any veneer of calm about it that an untrained eye could identify. Himari kept avoiding the eye contact of nurses who tried to comfort her, repeating, "I was only away for 2 days! I was only away for 2 days! 2 days is not a long time! I was only gone for 2 days! 2 days isn't a long time!
A room can wait for 2 days. I was only gone for 2 days. Nobody could make any sense of it. Himari, right around 18, well, 22 when she reappeared, though she did not seem to have aged, had a photographic memory for transportation systems of Japan. She had a photographic memory of most things, having been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Such individuals often think pictorially. As a legal adult whose mother paid the bill for her room at the hospital from a carefully managed account, she retained a relatively high degree of liberty. When she crossed the legal Rubicon of age into adulthood on her 18th birthday, she became classified as unrestricted and could come and go at her leisure, with or without a group or chaperone, except for a curfew in the mental health facility, which began at precisely 9 in the evening and continued until sunrise. This was not the status enjoyed by all guests of the hospital. Many could not leave or required some sort of supervision from a trusted professional. With Himari, given her particular mental issue, her facility for living on her own, and the Yamaguchi Gumi money from her mother's mafia ties, it was allowed. Himari was autistic but high-functioning and even held an odd job here or there as a teenager. She kept her hair short and dressed in a loose, casual way. Pajamas, parachute pants, long skirts, and tops covered in cartoon characters were her primary style. These would be cycled through the week in the same patterns. She had a habit of looking off and to the side, and one or the other of her hands was always making little gestures, stimming, as those familiar with the behavior call it. Many with ASD have a drive for consistent stimulation. They might rub their fingers together in fast patterns or blink their eyes a certain number of times very fast at intervals, or dance their legs around when sitting. Himari was no different, and one or the other of her hands was always doing something, though in a delicate way, one that appeared less ASD and more ASD and more quirky. Please excuse the interruption. There is a reason manic pixie dream girls in romantic comedies adopt such mannerisms. Himari was no manic pixie dream girl. She was definitely autistic, but her constant stimming was indeed core to her personality. The conflation with romantic comedy heroines caused many young Japanese men to approach her unaware, especially those of the herbivore variety. Such approach by strangers would generally initiate a panic response from Himari that in turn scared them off. The trauma was mutual. On seeing her room totally reorganized to fit the needs of a different mental patient, her panic response kicked in at full force, and she absolutely terrified staff on the ward before being sedated, taken to an empty bed, and left under observation. Authorities were immediately notified, but when Himari was identified, ambulance chasers monitoring emergency radio sequences began to show up and make a stink. Here was a dismembered missing person with a convicted murderer behind bars for her death. One whose remains were fed to cats, no less, which had no small effect on the traffic to Cat Island, and now she was walking around a hospital having autistic fits. The coverage actually initiated an urban legend as abruptly, despite the fact that she was right in the hospital for most of a week, everyone was having Himari sightings. This would continue for many years after the event, as such urban legends have always been popular in Japan, and when Himari disappeared again, it only fueled the fire. On the enigmatic autist's arrival that first evening, hospital staff eventually decided to simply give in to her indefatigable demands. It took hours, but they shuffled the resident from her old room, room 333, to another in the facility, and they moved her back in.
Only when this was complete was her mother contacted. But her mother didn't pick up any phone number that was called, likely owing to a substance-related issue. And so the hospital was in a liminal PR purgatory until the girl reprised her vanishing act. They would have avoided any contact with the media if they could have. But notifying authorities, as staff had done when Himari unexpectedly arrived, alerted those predatory journalists. Concurrent with dispatchers sending police to the hospital was a descent of social justice warrior locusts in journalists' clothes who used the internet to inflate the outlandish circumstance as much as possible. The story was getting international attention by daylight. Only after all these things did Himari Fujimoto disappear the second time. The night of her second disappearance was well recorded on a variety of hospital surveillance databases. A young lady who was new to the wing strolled by the area, presided over by the night nurse on duty, said, "It was so nice of you to bring her a cat. And he's such a pretty boy with that long black fur and his little white foot. He's a little mink." The night nurse squinted. "What cat?" "Room 333, the autistic one. Pet therapy is so helpful. I'm glad to see it is a practice here. I didn't expect to see it after college. Just a question. Where do you keep them? The cats, I mean. I might need a little therapy myself." And she giggled. The night nurse shook her head. "We don't do that here. Diseases." "But down the hall, in room 333, she has a cat. Did she bring it? Where did she get it?" "We're going to find out." The night nurse stood from the desk in the center of the wing and put on her disgruntled lunch lady face, which really wasn't all that different from her board secretary face. The newbie who alerted her trailed behind with a look of confusion. When they opened the door to room 333 and no one was there, no cat or human being, both women looked at each other in shock and ran to the security room. Himari's headquarters were under surveillance. There was a feed on the room around the clock. Running the footage back, the nurses saw a muted glow from beneath the bed that you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look for it. And then Himari crawled out backward from under the bed and scooted onto its edge. A moment later, a cat backed out from under the bed and jumped in reverse to the mattress beside her. The footage was stopped and played normally. A cat walked into frame from under the bed. Himari did not bring the cat into the room with her. The cat jumped on the bed and nuzzled Himari, who took several moments to turn her head so she could see the animal, and then began to pet him in precise strokes the cat enjoyed, before finding some beef jerky and feeding him. For the past week, she insisted on having several bags of beef jerky around her at all times, but didn't eat any. Now this mystery had an answer. The cat nuzzled her again and purred. This could be heard on the recording. Then the cat jumped under the bed and she followed. The underside of the bed glowed for approximately 5 minutes, then the glow faded. This light show looked slightly unusual in surveillance footage, but not extremely remarkable. It was something you wouldn't notice unless you were specifically looking for it. Patients often crawled under the bed at that hospital. If they didn't damage anything or run off, it was a non-issue. When the footage was played, everybody made brief eye contact, went pale. Then the nurses, followed by the surveillance man, sprinted to the room and looked under the bed. There was nothing. Maybe the smallest dust-like morsel of beef jerky on the floor. A missing persons search commenced, and every member of the hospital staff were questioned. Owing to the ongoing media fascination and Himari's week-long residency before disappearance number 2, the Yamaguchi Gumi now unequivocally suspected the Inigawa Kai, despite the footage. And there were altercations in many prefectures across Japan. Sergeant Kaido Yamada was an inspector by this time, and it quickly became his business to provide full investigation support for the incident, especially given his history with the case. Since the hospital was in a different prefecture than Ehime, he didn't receive any news until the girl disappeared the second time. And the media had a compound spasm. Kaido wasn't one to follow social media trends, memes, or urban legends. Even so, at that point, it was impossible not to see the news. Within a few days of her reappearance and disappearance, he made his way to the hospital to review the footage and took statements from all staff, confirming to several cognitive decimal places that indeed the young woman did legitimately show up out of nowhere, then disappear into nowhere, all in about a week. There was a long-haired black cat with a white paw involved, and something that glowed from under the bed. That was it. Now Japanese teenagers had a new favorite ghost story. As time went by, the media remembered the young man, Hotaru Suzuki, who was now on death row owing to the disappearance of Himari Fujimoto. Inspector Kaido Yamada became the focus of a spin-off media firestorm, which was fueled by the defense attorneys of a man wrongfully accused. Said attorneys were only too happy to focus all ire upon Kaido and set him up in effigy for the ills of the system entire. After about 5 months of this, Kaido had enough. He didn't know how Himari Fujimoto disappeared the first time. He didn't know how she reappeared. He didn't know how she disappeared the second time. He didn't know what the cat had to do with it, and he had obviously been instrumental in putting the wrong man behind bars. He was ultimately forced to admit the receipt his officer presented as evidence was a plant. They picked a patsy and pinned him to the table. It was worse than injustice. It was injustice from the fount of justice and defended by the state. For the state certainly sent attorneys to fight Kaido's cause. They had to. The whole department was under scrutiny. Kaido started drinking, put on 20 pounds, and quit. If there was one good thing that came out of it all, he visited his mother a little more often. She was in a coma with over 1,000 others at a special hospital that became what it was in 2020 during the pandemic crisis. He held her hand by the bed where she was hooked into endless tubes. He spoke kind words to her, fluffed pillows, brought flowers, let in a little more light from the afternoon, and told her everything while she breathed regularly on that damned blanking machine. Here she was in the middle of some science fiction fate worse than death, and Kaido strongly suspected bad medicine. What could be done, though? Would he care for her in his home? He could try. But he wasn't even a good enough inspector to put the right man away. What foolish pains would he bring on his unconscious mother? There was a certain doctor at the coma facility, and he came in after Kaido carefully repositioned his mother's hand and turned to stare out the window. There was some new treatment involving the brain, and the doctor was hooking a piece of equipment up to his mother's head. They made polite small talk, and he conducted a few tests to make sure he put things in place properly. Then turned to Kaido and said, "Thanks again for your support on this experimental procedure. I wanted to show you something, Inspector Yamada-san." "Ex-inspector," Kaido clarified. "Oh," paused the doctor, but somehow it seemed as though his words were put on, as though he knew this little tidbit of information beforehand. He continued, "Anyway, look at my tablet here. Let me turn the sound up." It was a feed of his mother from that morning, only a few hours before he checked in at the lobby. Suddenly, Kaido snatched the tablet from the doctor, ran the footage back, and went to better light. Her lips were moving. He listened to the speaker. "Always keep honor, Kaido," she said, breathing hard with each word. Her eyes fluttered open. Then the machines resumed their normal sequence, and she was unconscious again. Kaido ran the footage back a dozen times. It was certainly the genuine article. Wasn't it? Something was off about her words. Honor? Well,
But honor.
Finally, the doctor motioned for him to return it. Kaido gave back the tablet and bowed, and thanked the doctor, and left. This would require serious thought and serious drink, both of which he pursued at a tavern near where he lived.
Honor.
What honor? How could he salvage honor here? Well, he could find the missing ASD kid, couldn't he? Determine what happened, put an end to the mystery, punctuation on the meme. Everybody loved a redemption arc, maybe. Honor. The footage was burned into his mind, but it was so uncanny, he just couldn't put his finger on it. His sixth sense was making a jangling cacophony at the back of his subconscious mind. So he continued to ruminate, allowing the concepts to stew. He'd been going to seed about a month when it hit him. Who was the girl's father? In fact, who was this girl, representing some sort of ASD royalty among the Yamaguchi Gumi? The more he thought about it, the more these questions consumed him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he came to the conclusion that the restoration of his honor required solving this mystery for himself, for his mother, for the public, for Hotaru, for the police station once representing his career's home port, hell, even for Himari. His resignation was not without pension, and his history with the Force was not without positive regard. He could float for years, at least financially, till he figured out what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. He wouldn't be the first Japanese inspector cast from the Force for planting evidence. Especially with Yakuza cases, that tended to be, in a convoluted way, ethically legitimate. When a police chief is on Yakuza payroll, sometimes the only way to rein in a rogue enforcer posing a serious threat to the public was to catch him on a fake charge. Is there more or less honor in letting the thugs stab people indiscriminately just because the fix is in? Such gray area rationalization is increasingly prevalent in large municipalities, Japanese or otherwise. And so those who are collaterally damaged in the process aren't always seen as villains by their fellow officers. Maybe the media and public gained a degree of distaste for the police from the kerfuffle, but the police themselves never ceased to support their man Kaido. If he could find out what happened, then their faith in him might just pay off. Maybe this investigation was exactly the right move. So retired Inspector Kaido Yamada arranged a meeting with Yami Fujimoto, Himari Fujimoto's mother. She lived in Sapporo to the north, and it was a long trip. Kaido had to take a room 3 nights up and back, renting a car in Sapporo to give him a little more freedom and time to get an idea who Yami was. Who she was a piece of work. The meeting went like this. Come in, Inspector-san. Come in, drink this, come in. She handed him something strong and cold. Yami put real effort into looking attractive, and it wouldn't have been lost on Kaido Yamada, except for the circumstances. These circumstances made her attire wildly inappropriate. It was a sparkling dress that put strategic bits of her anatomy on full display. I'm no longer an Inspector Fujimoto-san, but I will accept your drink. Yes, come, sit with me on the couch. Tell me everything. Kaido allowed her advance and let her sit right next to him. He said, I'll finish this drink, but I need to ask questions, and then I need to leave. I can't stay. Sure you can, Inspector-san.
You quit. And you're going to have a week into this trip if you came all the way up from Ehime. How did you know I quit and wasn't fired? Oh, ask your questions and let's get to the casual sex. Yami tipped her head back and finished the double vodka whatever in her glass, placing a hand on the inside of Kaido's left thigh as she did so. Actually, Fujimoto-san, call me Yami. Yami, I came to ask about Himari Fujimoto's father. He's dead, she said flatly, and the hand was swiftly withdrawn. Is he? How did he die? Like her. He just disappeared. Like everybody does in my life. They just disappear. She pouted and let a strap fall down from her dress over her shoulder. Then she smiled and said, but maybe I had something to do with it, didn't I? And she mischievously tapped his nose with a dainty finger. Kaido Yamada looked straight ahead and exhaled. When did he disappear, Yami? You know what my name means, Inspector-san? Please, I am no longer an inspector. It means darkness. Fujimoto is the wisteria tree. I am darkness under the wisteria tree. Sexy, right? Do you know what Himari means, Inspector-san? I can't recall. It means sunflower. And that's what her father wanted to name a daughter, if we had one. Sunflower under the wisteria tree. A boy would have been Haru, spring, under the wisteria tree. He knew I couldn't take his name. I couldn't. So he wanted to compliment my own, but he was never around to name her. Oh, how sad, yes. How sad, how tragic that he never knew she was growing inside me. The laughter that followed undercut her words. Because he wasn't supposed to be in Japan anyway. And Inikawa Kai killed him. How do you know these things? Because everybody knows he had it coming. So he is dead. And I was sad. Yes, I think I was truly sad a while. And then I had Himari, my sunflower, and his sunflower. But her brain, it's missing some gears in the engine, you know? I've done my best, but it just doesn't work, and I've never been any good for her since she was a baby, and the doctors do a better job. And she made it to the age of majority after all. So I did fine. And now it's just me. And it's just you. And what more is there to talk about? Do you have a picture of Himari's father? Said Yami. But she pulled herself stumblingly from the couch and meandered off for a moment, swaying under the influence. She returned from a far room with a piece of printed paper. It showed a young Caucasian male holding a balalaika. Gaijin? Kaida asked. Yes. Gaijin under good. Yami rolled her head with a laugh and leaned heavily into the couch, pushing her body against Kaido. She said girth in English. Kaido stood quickly, and she folded against the armrest with an indecorous squawk. Thank you for this, Fujimoto-san. I will tell you what I find.
He drained his glass. It was strong, and he realized he'd need to eat something soon. On the last swallow, he couldn't restrain a cough and had to take a breath while his face explored contortions. He covered this by bowing fast.
You're going? I will return to tell you what I find. Go then. That's what men do. They just come and go. Come and go. Sayonara, Fujimoto-san.
And he bowed again more deeply, then beat a hasty retreat. In the rental car, he looked at the picture of the young man, the gaijin, the foreigner. The man had a bandana tied about the top of his head under his hair and looked quite the gypsy. He was bearded. Kaido couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt he had seen that face somewhere before. Somewhere he should remember. Something important happened to him. There was a bright flash in his mind, and abruptly he had goose flesh. Then it was gone. Now his head hurt a little. It was like the information hid behind a headache barrier. The more he thought about it, the more he didn't want to think about it. Strange. At length, he folded the picture and put it in his wallet. It wasn't much, but it was something. He pulled out from the parking lot and turned south toward his hotel. Several moments later, a late-model sedan of forgettable gray color pulled out after him and neglected to turn on any headlights. Meanwhile, Hotaru Suzuki, the manga artist previously incarcerated for a murder that never happened, was picked up as a client by a legal team focusing on human rights violations. Ultimately, he had his name restored in addition to about 150 million yen paid out by the government, which is around $1 million in U.S. currency. Hotaru emerged from his ordeal on death row, skinnier and tougher and meaner and much richer, but somehow no less socially awkward. He moved to the north of Japan, resolving to live out his days in even greater seclusion. And that's how Hotaru Suzuki won the lottery.